is still not quite near the peak levels we had seen previously. So,
10%, there's 9% in manufacturing.
You raise a very interesting point, but I think there are other aspects to it as well. For example, I'm sure the folks at the Federal Reserve might like to address it in terms of what this really means in terms of growth in the aggregates and so on. I think all of us would agree that there has been a broadening out of liquidity in this marketplace. And from a theoretical perspective, one could say that as long as that capital is being allocated efficiently, we're all better off. We're all better off if it is in fact going to those companies that can generate jobs, that can generate income and so on. What we all have to decide as a marketplace is whether that capital has been allocated efficiently.
Gentleman in the back.
Bill Spriggs, Research Director with the National Urban League. Jamie, I'm going to challenge your optimism on 2 points. One is no one seemed to mention the new labor force. This is actually really a different labor force generated by affirmative action. Today, women make a much bigger share of our labor force than the 70s economy, even the 80s economy that generated the rules that you talked about. The African American labor force today is better educated than the white labor force of the 1970s. So that's a big difference. In fact, one of the things about the shortage of labor, the African American labor participation rate today is virtually statistically equal to that of whites, mostly because of this new economy and because the president has made a big push on defending what has been a big backlash against affirmative action. So one question, Jamie, is as this backlash to affirmative action continues, are we going to threaten this new labor force, which is much more equally educated than what we had in the past and has introduced many more workers at a much higher participation rate than we had in the past? And the other question, Jamie, is we talked about how recessions used to be shorter, in part because a lot of our income support were entitlements. And so we had what we used to call automatic stabilizers to instantly kick in. What happens now that most of those income supports are not entitlements if we have another recession? Are you still as optimistic?
Well, I think that affirmative action came into being with very broad political support at a time when inequality was considerably less in the pay structure than it became in the 1980s. And the opposition to affirmative action was in part a function of increases in inequality. That is to say, there were fewer highly favored positions to compete for, and there began to be a vociferous opposition to making those slots widely available. If the expansion continues and inequality continues to improve, as Martin Bailey also alluded to, it seems to me that the tide will turn on affirmative action, which I strongly favor, and that we can look forward to a period where, in a sustained expansion, we continue to broaden access to the best opportunities. So I'm afraid I'm still optimistic if policy is conducted in the correct way. The second part of your question was predicated on the occurrence of a recession. And while, I would modestly correct Martin's characterizations of my views, I'm not in favor of a let-her-rip policy. I'm not necessarily in favor of an expansionary policy. I'm merely opposed to a contractionary policy. I'm opposed to putting on either the monetary or the fiscal brakes in such a way that could threaten the expansion. And it seems to me that if we are simply vigilant and do not do this, the most likely outcome is that the expansion will continue. The American economy is an extremely robust animal. Even a serious attempt to slow it down will take time and take really severe measures, which may be coming for all we know. But it seems to me that if we avoid those measures, we will continue to test the limits of what our advanced sectors are capable of producing. And also, Bill Nordhaus made this point very effectively, of all of the improvements in organization, inventory management, production process that the older sectors are capable of, And I'm inclined to think, and just to get back to the original point that you made, that even though we are upgrading our labor force, our population considerably, our education standards are higher than they were 30 years ago, I don't think that most Americans are as productively or as effectively employed as they could be. I think there's a great deal of potential still to exploit. And, we may come to a limit in 5 or 10 years, but ask me then. I'm no better at predicting these things than anybody else.
I would just like to make a couple of observations now, just very briefly about this. Even though the participation of women in the labor force is the highest it's ever been, the unemployment rate among women is the lowest in 40 years. And that's the good news. The bad news is there's still about 25% pay gap. The unemployment rate among African Americans and Hispanics is the lowest we've ever recorded, although we've only been disaggregating it for, I think, just a little less than 30 years. But still, it's much lower. But the per capita income is still quite different. There's a lot of difference. The poverty rate has gone down dramatically among African Americans and Hispanics, but not as much for Hispanics as African Americans, I suspect, because we have more first-generation immigrants coming in still who are classified as Hispanics in all this data collection that we do. I would just like to posit, first of all, my sense is, and I fought this battle hard, for all these years, that the opposition to affirmative action is easing again as the middle class members of the majority feel a little more secure. But what I'm interested in is how do we take these hopeful numbers and sort of translate them into genuine economic parity? For example, we're debating in the Congress now how much we ought to raise the cap for the H-1B visas. Those are basically to get the high-tech workers in the Silicon Valley, into the Washington, D.C. area and other places. And I basically, I'm a pro-immigration person generally. I think it's made our country stronger, and I'm not against this. But we don't still have, in my judgment, a comprehensive enough strategy to move a lot of African Americans and Hispanics who are in the workforce now, so they have X level of education, but they're not yet in the new economy, into that so that they're fully participating. And I think that this is still a continuing challenge for us. 2 years ago, African American high school graduation rates equaled white graduation rates for the first time in history. That's the good news. And all these things you said are absolutely right. But we're still not there on college going, college graduation, and participation in the new economy, and we need a lot of focus on it. Second question you ask is what happens the next time there's a recession? I'd like to point out, if I might defend the position I took briefly in the welfare reform, we basically, welfare reform, in terms of the money that welfare recipients got, was already a state-determined entitlement before welfare reform, because the states got to set how much they were given. So the rate for a family of three varied everywhere from $187 a month, roughly, in Mississippi, and about that much in Texas, to $655 a month in Vermont before welfare reform. We kept the national requirement for food stamps and for medicine. And what we're trying to do is find more efficient ways to move people into the workforce. We have done that. The great unanswered question is, if there is high unemployment again, what do we do with the work requirements, and how do we make sure people get a good income stream when they literally can't go into the workforce? And that's a challenge that will have to be addressed. But the tools are there to do it. Yes.
I'd just like to make the comment that the new economy is really a global phenomenon. We've been really focused on the U.S. In China, for example, they're creating an equity culture very rapidly. There are now 80 million shareholders versus 65 million members of the Communist Party.
That's good.
This is a culture where still you have the highest savings rate in the world, almost 50%, or between 40 and 50%. So I think as we're talking about everything we're talking about today, the danger is to just focus on the United States without looking at our competitive position around the world and not realizing that some of the greatest growth, the greatest opportunities might be outside the new economy in the United States. I just
You guys want to talk about that?
Well, if I can make one comment, we often talk about the enormous advantages to the U.S. consumer that may come about as different companies use the internet and other aspects to improve their distribution systems. Well, we already have a fairly efficient distribution system to the U.S. consumer, and as we look around the rest of the world, perhaps the greatest beneficiaries will be those consumers in nations with very inefficient distribution systems, such as those in Japan, where there are layer upon layer of intermediaries between the producer and the ultimate consumer and user of those goods.
Bob?
First, I'd like to reinforce, thank you. First, I'd like to reinforce Abby's point at the beginning about education. It's going to be very hard for U.S. business to remain competitive if we don't have a competitive educational system. And we have a two-tiered system now. The top is very competitive. Universities are very competitive. K through 12, unfortunately, is not. And a lot of other countries are going to be moving ahead very dramatically in that area and leave a lot of our workers behind if we don't catch up. Britain suffered the same problem. It was ahead in the Industrial Revolution in the 1800s. It neglected education, particularly the education of its poor, lower class people in urban areas, which was a big problem, which led not only to the weakening of the economy, but the sort of class divisions which Britain still suffered from. So that complacency about education, I think, is particularly important to deal with. We dealt with it in the early part of the century through what was called the high school movement, where, as Abby said, local governments made a major effort to bring kids off the farm into the new economy. If we don't do that now, we're going to lose further and further, we'll get further and further behind other countries which are placing a lot more emphasis on building the workforce for the next decades. Second point particularly relates to intellectual property. In this knowledge-based revolution, protection of intellectual property is extremely important. One of the problems that occurred, as you know, Mr. President, after your statement with Tony Blair about patenting of genes, which I think was badly misinterpreted, was the impression was created that somehow the U.S. was not as strong in protecting intellectual property and patents as I know it is, and therefore to the degree that you could clarify that over a period of time, particularly as the genetic sequencing becomes more obvious and is announced, that would be very helpful in demonstrating that this government does, both domestically and internationally, attach a great deal of importance to protection of intellectual property, which I think is critically important for a lot of the research and development that is critical to the knowledge revolution. Thank you.
So since we want to hear from everybody, I can't possibly answer the education question, but I'll give you one sentence on it. Every problem in American education has been solved by somebody somewhere. There are public schools performing at an astonishing level with children from very diverse backgrounds in terms of income, race, ethnicity, and first language. The big challenge in American education is nobody has figured out a mechanism to make what works in a lot of places work everywhere, which is why we're trying to change the law to stop giving out federal money to people who don't produce results and spend it based on things that we know will work. This is not a cause for despair. There are success stories everywhere under breathtakingly difficult circumstances. The problem is we haven't figured out how to replicate it, or we don't have enough incentives to replicate it, and that ought to be something that we focus on. Plus, bringing opportunity out there. Kids ought not, in New York City, you got kids going to school in buildings that are heated by coal. We have schools that are too old to be wired for the internet. We got a lot of physical problems that we have to continue to invest in, but we are moving on that. On the patent thing, Tony Blair and I crashed the market there for a day, and I didn't mean to. But I think what happened is that when the markets recovered, I think what happened is people actually read the statement instead of the headlines or whatever. I think in the biotech area, our position ought to be clear, but general information ought to be in the public domain as much as possible about the sequencing of the human genome. And where public money contributed to massive research on the basic information, we ought to get it out there. If someone discovers something that has a specific commercial application, they ought to be able to get a patent on it. And the question is always going to be, are you drawing the line in the right place? But I believe we've got the people together with the skills and the experience to draw the line in the right place. And I think that's the right policy. I'm quite confident it is. And what we really need now is to make sure it is implemented in the right way. Fred? And we'll just keep going.
Fred Bergston from the Institute for International Economics. I strongly share the optimism of the panel and want to just note that one might even give some credit to globalization for some of the impact. Abby Cohen talked about the new attitude of business. A lot of that has to do with the pressures of globalization, and when we're drawing up a globalization balance sheet, we have to put that on the positive side. But lest this be too euphoric, I want to say that I think there is one big imbalance in the economy that nobody has mentioned, somewhat to my surprise, and that's the huge and growing trade deficit. The trade and current account deficits both hit an annual rate of 4% of GDP in the last quarter. They are rising sharply. They are clearly into zones where in the past there has been a sharp reaction, including a reaction in the exchange market for the dollar. A sharp decline of the dollar would push up inflation, would push up interest rates. That in turn would push down the stock market. That triple hit could be the speed limit that we're worried about. The U.S. has experienced a sharp fall in the dollar once a decade in the post-war period, and so we can't ignore it. So the question to the panel, do you think the new economy and the new economy rules will repeal the concern that the exchange markets, the international markets have had in the past, which countries as diverse as the UK, Italy, Mexico, Thailand, and Korea thought they could ignore in the last decade, but obviously couldn't? Can we ignore that, or is that a potential speed limit that we better pay more attention to?
Jamie?
Well, I considered mentioning the trade deficit and decided not to because I wouldn't want to encourage the idea that we should react to it preemptively by cutting demand, raising unemployment, and attempting to cut our imports that way. It seems to me that would be a very counterproductive approach because it would simply bring the rest of the world economy further down. The structural problem that we have is that in a globalized environment, we really haven't figured out a way to assure stable growth in the developing and emerging economies, which are our major markets for advanced exports. Some of them, like China, have enjoyed extraordinarily rapid growth over decades and are now major purchasers of such things as aircraft and other advanced products that we build. But in the case, of course, of the Asian economies, a period of rapid growth over 3 or 4 years was then followed by a very, very sharp crisis. Over in Latin America, growth has been well below potential really since the 1980s, with only very limited periods of strong growth. So it does seem to me that we have a problem of construction. That is to say that we need to work on the system of international institutions that need to bear some responsibility for managing and stabilizing growth and development processes. I know, Fred, that you just served on a commission to advise on these questions, and I read your very eloquent statement in the report of that commission. It seems to me that our task really is not to tear down the institutions that we have, but to build effective institutions that can address the instabilities that really are depressing the growth rate, the potential growth of our exports into world markets in the long run.
Well, I think my answer would be, it's actually to this as well as some of the earlier comments, that what we're witnessing is real, but it's not going to repeal the basic laws of economics. That we have many problems which continue, and I would say things like distorted investment, which has been mentioned. I think the distortion in asset markets is considerable. And I think distortion in career choices is something I worry about a little bit. When I talked to my students a generation ago, they would go into a wide variety of professions, but now they've all got a gleam of gold in their eye and are heading off to either the new economy or the areas that finance the new economy. So we still have some structural problems, but I think my own view is that this improvement gives us kind of breathing room to do some things that we need to do, like improve the budget situation, increase national saving, run this tight labor market for as long as we can, and nobody knows how long it will be. And I hope it does continue. But there are still these pockets of concern, some of which are quite considerable, that we have to keep our eye on.
If I could just make one comment about this, I'm worried about it, the size of the trade deficit. But I would like to just make two counter-arguments that you should all consider. There's no question in my mind that the openness of our markets in the last 7 years has kept inflation down and enabled us to grow more. And I could give you lots of very specific examples when we began to see tightening of supplies and give various products and services where there'd be a little spike and it'd come down. The second thing is we had a very strong economy and more growth than our friends in Europe and Japan did, both at the time of the Mexican crisis, which imperiled all of Latin America, and at the time of the Asian financial crisis. Now, I think those things happened for reasons that all of us could debate till the cows come home, and I think there have been some improvements in the international financial architecture which will minimize the likelihood of the recurrence of that. But I believe that America keeping its markets open, even absorbing a bigger deficit, helped Asia to recover more quickly, helped Mexico to recover more quickly, and over the long run, therefore, was good for the American economy as well as being a responsible thing to do. So I'm worried about it, but given the historical facts surrounding each of the last 4 or 5 years.
Living there is all of the foreign nationals who are working there. But of course, one of the reasons there are so many foreign nationals working there is that we are not doing an adequate job of educating our students in math and science. And ironically, the new economy is working against this because the public schools can't compete for the people who have knowledge in this area with these companies that we are creating today. And I worry that unless we do something really dramatic, it's going to get worse. And with all due respect, sir, I think that wiring the schools is not sufficient. It's important, but we need to provide our teachers with adequate training and with technical support because, as we all know, using a PC is not necessarily a trivial thing to do. And we also, I think, need to really focus on reaching out to minorities and women. If you look at my field, the number of women in entering computer science baccalaureate programs dropped precipitously in the 80s, and it has not gone up to where it was. And minorities are very underrepresented. The second point I want to raise is relating to intellectual property. I would like to respectfully disagree with the questioner who raised that point. One of the things that worries many scientists and academics is that intellectual property is going to be too tightly controlled in the future in terms of copyright and protections, for example, for databases. And if we create too tight controls, we will basically kill the goose that laid the golden egg.
If I could just make one observation, I think another thing you're going to have to make up our minds to do if we want the schools to function well is to pay the teachers enough to get good teachers. And California has just passed a very impressive reform proposal that will allow very large bonuses to go to teachers that actually produce results. And I'm going to be very interested to see whether it meets with the support of the people and actually produces improved learning outcomes. But teachers in California are actually going to be able to make a decent living as a result of the reforms just adopted by the legislature that the governor supported. So that, I think, you all have to come to terms with this. We've got the biggest student body in American history, the most diverse one, and 2 million teachers are about to retire. So for all of our reform prescriptions, if you want good people to go into these classrooms, they're going to have to be paid. Yes, sir.
Sungwon Son from Wells Fargo Bank. I'd like to direct these questions to Professor Nordhaus and Kim. The first question is, we are correctly celebrating productivity gains, but a couple of things worries me. Number one is computer prices. Inflation rate has been kept down to a significant extent because of the decline in computer prices. Without that, we find that really the productivity gains are not as high as it is. And the question really is, can we continue to count on the precipitous decline in computer prices to support productivity gains? That's the first question to Professor Nordhaus. A related question, the other thing that worries me is to really Kim is our research shows that many of these high technology companies have high break-even points because of software development cost, infrastructure for plant and equipment, and marketing, and et cetera. So in an economic downturn, because you have a high break-even point, could technology companies actually accelerate economic declines? And I guess that is really the second question.
I think you raise an important point, which is that much of the productivity upsurge since roughly 1995 has been due to what I call, it's actually not just computers, but what I call the information technology sector of computer hardware, software, and communications. A rough guess is that about 2/3 of the upturn has been due to those, and we don't really know what the other third is, whether it's cyclical or whether it's the numbers or whether it's what's going on in other sectors. And we don't know how long it's going to continue. But just because it's computers doesn't mean it's not real. I mean, that is leading to real gains in the way we conduct our lives and the goods and services that we produce and we consume. My own guess is that I don't expect that to rise enormously, but I don't see any reason why it can't continue for the foreseeable future, which is not very far.
Question. I think actually competition, I think prices of PCs are going to not only continue to drop, but what we're going to see is appliances that really replace PCs across the board. And what I see when I work with companies out there is now so many new companies getting into the business of creating these new internet appliances that will be basically delivered to consumers, that will be either free or extremely cheap. And those prices are going to continue to go down. What's going to be the fees are going to be the transaction or service fees that people pay to subscribe to, the financial portfolio management service or the game service or information services, whatever they may be. So, in fact, I see the trend continuing, the drop in PC or hardware prices, and I see that becoming less and less of an issue because the pricing shifts from the physical asset to the services that companies deliver, and competition is only just beginning there.
I'm going to call on the gentleman over on the left, and then I'm going to have to call this session to a close because we've got to go to the breakout sessions. We have 2 more panels, and we'll all be able to continue this conversation. But go ahead. This is the last question.
Mr. President, Amanda Brimmer. I would like to go back to a question that was raised about regulation. I see regulation, and particularly conflicts among regulations at the federal and state level, as a real risk to the new economy. And I wonder whether you would have any comments, or at least perhaps later in the day, we might have some discussion of it. Particularly, I'm raising the question about the increased tendency of states to step in to regulate activity which previously had been regulated at the federal level. Several examples. For example, in California, the regulations regarding clean air are clashing with the federal regulations concerning clean air, and it imposing quite a burden on transportation and other kinds of pollution development. In the area of regulation of telephones, airlines, in the past, these have been federal regulations. And I wonder whether you would have any comments on the extent to which the states are now intruding more and more into this area. And in my judgment, this might have a severely adverse impact on the emergence of innovations in the future. Thank you.
What I'd like to do is give our panelists here a chance to comment. I have some thoughts on it, but we're going to have a panel. The last panel of the day is going to deal with the impact of the new economy on governance. And it's a very, very important issue, so I hope you'll all hang around for it. But I'll defer what I have to say to Lynn. But would any of you like to talk about this? Go ahead.
Just a brief word. I think there's a fair amount of devolution of regulation from the federal government to the states, and some of it well-designed and some of it not. But there's a fundamental difference between federal and state regulation. As Americans, we can't escape federal regulation, but we can escape badly designed state regulations. And so, particularly in industries like this, which are relatively footloose and can migrate, It's not that we don't worry about it, but the state of California does not have a monopoly on American technology. And so if it or Connecticut or other states do this, there will be migration of economic activity. So it's not something that we want to encourage, obviously, but it's less worrisome than it would be if it were done at the federal level.
Let me say before we leave, since a couple of you mentioned the global aspect of this, I just got a note that I think is very good news. The Speaker of the House, Dennis Hastert, announced this morning that he scheduled a vote on permanent normal trading relations with China, which would open their markets to our goods and services for the week of May the 22nd, and this is very good news. This agreement slashes tariffs by about half on everything from automobiles to agriculture to telecommunications, and it also slashes those tariffs which protect the state-run industries in China, which in large measure have been the instrument of single-party control there. So I think it will lead to an opening of the society and a rise in freedom and personal choice. We're talking about the new economy. 2 years ago, there were 2 million internet users in China. Last year, there were 9. I think this year there'll be somewhere between 20 and 25 million. So I think that this is very, very important, and I want to thank the Speaker and the leadership of the House for doing this, and I assure you I will do what I can to pass it. I think it's not only in our economic interest, this is a profoundly important national security interest for the United States, and so we're in the panel on a piece of good news. Thank you very much. Let's go into our breakout session. Thank you very much. Well, I hope you've enjoyed the conference to date. I heard the breakout sessions were wonderful. One of the things that I have not yet been able to do, although I still have hope that quantum physics will enable one of my successors to be in 5 places at once, but I haven't figured out how to do it yet. I'm delighted that you're all here again. After Mr. Greenspan speaks, we will have our 2 final panels, one on closing the global divide in education, health, and technology, and the second on strengthening civil society and empowering our citizens with new economic tools. The afternoon discussions will take up where the last one left off. This morning we had a panel which acknowledged that this new economy presents phenomenal opportunities and new challenges. The next panel will explain that the stakes are even higher for developing countries, and by extension, for poor areas within our own country. Today, there are more phone lines in Manhattan than there are in all of Africa. So we can imagine what the information infrastructure could mean to that entire continent. I want to discuss in the panel what we can actually do to help deal with a lot of these challenges. And I also hope in the second panel we will discuss not only how we as citizens relate to each other, our communities, and our government, but how government itself should change in the information age. Now, I want to introduce Chairman Greenspan by saying first that, as far as I know, he was one of the first people to speak of the new economy, the impact of information technology, and the extent to which it has rewritten the rules. Of course, he's done more than talk about it. His analysis has helped to shape the public's understanding of this powerful transformation, and his decisions have helped it to continue in our country apace. We're grateful for his 12 years of stewardship at the Federal Reserve. We're grateful that despite the seismic shifts in the global economy, he's kept his feet firmly planted on the ground. For 7 years now, I've had elaborate instructions from the Secretary of the Treasury and from all my staff about what I was supposed to say and not say about the Fed's decisions and about the chairman of the Fed. One of our major newspapers ran a story a couple of months ago referring to us as the odd couple. I took it as a compliment, and I hope he wasn't too chagrined. Ladies and gentlemen, the chairman of the Federal Reserve.
Mr. President, I took it as a compliment as well. It's really quite a privilege to be here amongst this distinguished audience, and thank you, sir, very much for inviting me. I'm going to cover some ground which most of you have heard me on, but try to put in a slightly different context than I usually do. It's certainly become increasingly difficult to deny that something profoundly different from the typical post-war business cycle has emerged in recent years. Not only has the expansion reached record length, but it has done so with far stronger than expected economic growth. Most remarkably, inflation has remained subdued in the face of labor markets tighter than we have experienced in at least a generation. While there are various competing explanations for an economy that is, in many respects, without precedent in our annals, the most compelling appears to be the extraordinary surge in technological innovation that developed through the latter decades of the last century. In the early 1990s, with little advance notice, those innovations began to offer sharply higher prospective returns on investment than had prevailed in earlier decades. The first sign of the shift was the sharp rise in capital investment orders, especially for high-tech equipment, in 1993. This was unusual for a cyclical expansion because it occurred a full 2 years after the trough of the 1991 recession. By 1995, the investment boom had gathered momentum, suggesting that earlier expectations of elevated profitability had not been disappointed. In that year, with inflation falling, domestic operating profit margins started to rise, indicating that increases in unit costs were slowing. These developments signaled that productivity growth was probably beginning to move higher, even though official data, hobbled by statistical problems, failed to provide any confirmation. Now, 5 years later, there can be little doubt that not only has productivity growth picked up from its rather tepid pace during the preceding quarter century, but that the growth rate has continued to rise, with scant evidence that it is about to crest. The acceleration of productivity stemming from the investment boom has held cost increases in check. Despite the surge in demand, unit labor costs over the past year have barely budged, and pricing power has remained well contained. Apparently, firms hesitate to raise prices for fear that their competitors will be able to wrest market share from them by employing new investments to produce at lower costs. Indeed, the increasing availability of labor-saving equipment and software at declining relative prices and with improving delivery lead times is arguably at the root of the loss of business pricing power in recent years. To be sure, marked increases in available global capacity and the deregulation of key industries have removed bottlenecks and increased the competitive supply response of many economies, especially ours, and these developments have been influential in suppressing price increases. It would be an exaggeration to imply that whenever a potential cost increase emerges on the horizon, a capital investment is available to quell it. Yet the veritable explosion of spending on high-tech equipment and software, which has raised the growth of the capital stock dramatically over the past 5 years, could hardly have occurred without a large increase in the pool of profitable projects available to business planners. As our experience over the past century and more attests, such surges in prospective investment profitability carry with them consequences for interest rates, which ultimately are part of the process that balances saving and investment in a non-inflationary economy. In these circumstances, rising credit demand is almost always reflected in an increase in corporate borrowing costs, and that has indeed been our recent experience, especially in longer-dated debt issues. Real interest rates on corporate bonds have risen more than a percentage point in the past couple of years. Home mortgage rates have risen comparably. The Federal Reserve has responded in a similar manner by gradually raising the federal funds rate over the past year. Certainly to have done otherwise, to have held the federal funds rate at last year's level, even as credit demands and market interest rates rose, would have required an inappropriately inflationary expansion of liquidity. It is difficult to imagine product price levels remaining tame over the longer haul had there been such an expansion of liquidity. In the event, of course, inflation has remained largely contained. To be sure, the tripling of crude oil prices has left its mark on headline inflation rates and inflicted considerable pain on some sectors of our economy. However, there is little evidence, at least to date, to suggest that oil price increases have started to embed themselves more broadly in the underlying cost structure of American business, that is, beyond the direct effects of the higher energy costs themselves. Nevertheless, despite the very recent declines in the price of oil, there are risks here that need to be monitored closely. Given the persistent strength of private credit demands, market interest rates would have risen even more were it not for the emergence of a sizable unified budget surplus following a long period of chronic deficits. More recently, the administration and the Congress have wisely chosen to wall off the surplus in the Social Security Trust Fund and to allow it to pay down Treasury debt held by the public. This action will surely contribute to sustaining the rapid private capital formation we have experienced in recent years. I see no reason that productivity growth cannot remain elevated or even increase further to the undeniable benefit of American businesses and workers. Achieving this outcome, however, requires that imbalances not arise to drive the expansion off course. Only a balanced prosperity can continue indefinitely. One that is not will eventually falter. A change in market interest rates is an important element of the balancing mechanism of a market economy. Some misalignments have arisen over the course of the expansion, owing largely to the increased rate of return on capital and a sizable wealth effect. Overall demand for goods and services for the past 4 years has been growing noticeably in excess of the enhanced growth in potential supply, defined as the sum of the growth in the working age population and productivity. An increasing share of goods and services required to meet this extra demand has been supplied by net imports, with the remainder the result of an increase in domestic production achieved by drawing down the pool of those we count as officially unemployed and those otherwise available to work. Short of a significant opening up of our borders to more immigration, an increase in employment beyond the growth of the working age population is limited to what remains of our shrinking pool of available workers. Although the sum of the unemployed and those not in the labor force but who nonetheless are available for work is still about 10 million, the level has been falling steadily. This year, the figure has been lower as a percentage of the population than at any time in the history of this series, which goes back to 1970. Should the pool of available workers continue to shrink, there is a point at which this safety valve for excess demand will effectively close, even in the face of accelerating productivity. We do not know where that point is, but presumably it would occur well before a full depletion of the pool of potential workers. When we reach that point, short of a repeal of the law of supply and demand, the scarcity of labor will almost surely induce a rise in hourly compensation gains that increasingly outpaces an even faster productivity growth, a condition that would cause unit costs to accelerate over time. Moreover, we do not know how long net imports and U.S. external debt can rise before foreign investors become reluctant to continue to add to their portfolios of claims against the United States. At that point, the safety valve of net imports could narrow or close. It is conceivable that these two buffers can continue to absorb an excess growth of demand over potential supply for quite a while longer. However, the significant uncertainty surrounding these new economic forces counsel prudence. We need to be careful to keep inflationary pressures contained. The evidence that inflation inhibits economic growth and job creation is too credible to ignore. Consequently, maintaining an environment of low and stable inflation provides the greatest opportunity for the dramatic increases in structural productivity to show through fully into higher standards of living. In that regard, readings from financial markets, despite their recent upheavals, suggest that participants perceive the most likely outcome to be a gradual adjustment to more balanced, non-inflationary growth. As I have argued previously, a substantial part of the excess growth of demand over potential supply owes to a wealth effect induced by the rising asset prices that have accompanied the run-up in potential rates of return on new and existing capital. The rise in stock prices, as well as in the capital gains on homes, has created a marked increase in purchasing power without providing an equivalent and immediate expansion in the supply of goods and services. That expansion in supply will occur only over time. The persuasive evidence that the wealth effect is contributing to the risk of imbalances in our economy, however, does not imply that the most straightforward way to restore balance in financial and product markets is for monetary policy to target asset price levels. Leaving aside the deeper question of whether asset price targeting is an appropriate governmental functioning, there is little, if any, evidence that monetary policy aimed at achieving that goal would be successful. The risks of investing in equities come primarily from uncertainty about future earnings and about the rates at which those earnings should be discounted, and much less from changes in overnight interest rates, the principal tool of the central bank. Consequently, even if we were to foster somewhat larger movements in short-term rates to address changes in stock prices, I doubt that investors' perceptions of equity risks would be much affected, and thus that equity prices would be meaningfully influenced. In short, monetary policy should focus on the broader economy and on pending inflationary or deflationary imbalances. Should changes in asset prices foster economic imbalances, as they appear to have done in recent years, it is the latter we need address, not asset prices. In the economy overall, one result of the more rapid pace of information technology innovation has been a visible acceleration of the process of so-called creative destruction, a shifting of capital from failing technologies into those technologies at the cutting edge. The process of capital reallocation across the economy has been assisted by a significant unbundling of risks in capital markets made possible by the development of innovative financial products, many of which themselves owe their viability to advances in information technology. There are few, if any, indications in the marketplace that the reallocation process pushed forward by financial markets is slowing. While growth in companies' projected earnings have been revised up almost continuously across many sectors of the economy in recent years, the gap in expected profit growth between technology firms and others has persistently widened. As a result, security analysts' projected 5-year growth of earnings for technology companies now stands nearly double that for the remaining S&P 500 firms. To the extent that there is an element of prescience in these expectations, it would reinforce the notion that technology synergies are still expanding and that expectations of productivity growth are still rising. There are many who argue, of course, that it is not prescience, but wishful thinking. History will judge. Before this revolution in information availability, most 20th century business decision-making had been hampered by pervasive uncertainty. Owing to the paucity of timely knowledge of customers' needs and of the location of inventories and materials flowing throughout complex production systems, businesses required substantial programmed redundancies to function effectively. Doubling up on materials and people was essential as backup to the inevitable misjudgments of the real-time state of play in a company. Decisions were made from information that was hours, days, or even weeks old. Accordingly, production planning required costly inventory safety stocks and backup teams of people to respond to the unanticipated and the misjudged. Clearly, the remarkable surge in the availability of more timely information in recent years has enabled business management to remove large swaths of inventory safety stocks and worker redundancies. That means fewer goods and worker hours are absorbed by activities that, while perceived as necessary insurance to sustain valued output, in the end produced nothing of value. These developments emphasize the essence of information technology, the expansion of knowledge and its obverse, the reduction of uncertainty. As a consequence, risk premiums that were associated with many forms of business activities have declined. In short, information technology raises output per hour in the total economy, principally by reducing hours worked on activities needed to guard productive processes against the unknown and the unanticipated. Narrowing the uncertainties reduces the number of hours required to maintain any given level of production readiness. Because knowledge is essentially irreversible, much, if not most, of the recent gains in productivity appear permanent. Expanding e-commerce is expected to significantly augment this trend. Already major efforts have been announced in the auto industry to move purchasing operations to the internet. Similar developments are planned or are in operation in many other industries as well. It appears to be only a matter of time before the internet becomes a prime venue for the trillions of dollars of business-to-business commerce conducted every year. Not all technologies, information or otherwise, however, increase productivity, that is, output per hour, by reducing the inputs necessary to produce existing or related products. Some new technologies bring about new goods and services with above-average value added per work hour. The dramatic advances in biotechnology, for example, are significantly increasing a broad range of productivity-expanding efforts in areas from agriculture to medicine. Indeed, in our dynamic labor markets, the resources made redundant by better information are being drawn to the newer activities and newer products many never before contemplated. The recent biotech innovations are most especially of this type, particularly the remarkable breadth of medical and pharmacological product development. One less welcome byproduct of rapid economic and technical change that needs to be addressed is the insecurity felt by many workers. This stems, I suspect, from fear of job skill obsolescence. Despite the tightest labor markets in a generation, for example, more workers currently report in a prominent survey that they are fearful of losing their jobs than was reported in 1991 at the bottom of the last recession. The marked movement of capital from failing technologies to those at the cutting edge has quickened the pace at which job skills become obsolete. The completion of high school used to equip the average worker with sufficient knowledge and skills to last a lifetime. That is no longer true, as evidenced by community colleges being inundated with workers returning to school to acquire new skills and by on-the-job training being expanded and upgraded by a large proportion of American business. It is not enough to create a job market that has enabled those with few skills to finally be able to grasp the first rung of the ladder to achievement. More generally, we must ensure that our whole population receives an education that will allow full and continuing participation in this dynamic period of American economic history. In summary, we appear to be in the midst of a period of rapid innovation that is bringing with it substantial and lasting benefits to our economy. But policymakers must be alert to the full range of possible outcomes. In the end, I do not believe we can go far wrong if we maintain a consistent, vigilant, non-inflationary monetary policy